Former Georgia high school teacher Kianna Davis looked directly toward the courtroom as prosecutors pressed her with the question that had been hanging over this case for nearly 6 years. If she didn't kill her 2-year-old son, then who did?
You say Kianna would never do anything like that.
That is correct.
But you deny having done it.
That is correct.
So who would have done it if the only two people were he and you?
That is a good question.
So we just don't know.
We don't.
For days, jurors had listened to doctors, investigators, forensic experts, and witnesses describe the final hours of little Karter Ambrose's life. They heard about devastating internal injuries, conflicting explanations, and a child whose condition, according to prosecutors, should have prompted an immediate trip to the emergency room. Yet when Davis took the stand in her own defense, she denied ever harming her son. When prosecutors pointed out that only she and her then-boyfriend, Kianna Davis, had been caring for Karter when those fatal injuries were believed to have occurred, Davis offered a response that instantly became one of the trial's defining moments. That is a good question we don't know.
So who would have done it if the only two people were he and you?
That is a good question.
So we just don't know.
We don't.
It wasn't just an answer. It became the central mystery of the entire trial. Because somewhere between an ordinary November morning and a frantic visit to a pediatrician's office, a healthy-looking toddler suffered injuries that medical experts would later describe as catastrophic. At first glance, it seemed like a heartbreaking medical emergency. On November 17, 2020, a mother rushed her unresponsive son into a pediatrician's office in Warner Robins, Georgia. Doctors immediately recognized the situation was critical. Despite every effort to save him, Karter died. By the time Kianna Davis stood trial in July 2026, prosecutors argued they had reconstructed the events leading to Karter's death. The defense insisted the state had built its case almost entirely on circumstantial evidence. The jury was left to answer a question with life-changing consequences. Did the evidence prove beyond a reasonable doubt that Kianna Davis was responsible for her son's death? Or were investigators missing something? To understand why that question became so difficult, investigators first had to reconstruct Karter's final days. In November 2020, Karter was living primarily with his mother, Kianna Davis, in Warner Robins, Georgia. At the time, Davis worked as a high school teacher. Her then-boyfriend, Kianna Davis, was also a regular presence in Karter's life. Nothing about those final days publicly suggested the investigation that would soon follow. According to testimony presented during trial, Karter began showing signs that something was seriously wrong. He complained about stomach pain. He vomited repeatedly. Instead of improving, prosecutors argued, his condition continued to deteriorate over several hours.
You were going to hear that from that Sunday evening until the day that Karter died. He was having stomach pain. He was throwing up.
Medical experts testified that injuries as severe as Karter's were not consistent with an ordinary childhood accident. In their opinion, they would have caused significant pain almost immediately. That raised another critical question. If Karter had been suffering for hours, why wasn't emergency medical help sought sooner? At that stage, investigators still didn't know the answer. But the timeline was beginning to matter. The people closest to Karter would soon find themselves at the center of that timeline. As investigators worked to reconstruct Karter Ambrose's final hours, one fact quickly became impossible to ignore. According to the evidence presented at trial, only a very small number of people had access to the 2-year-old during the period when medical experts believed his fatal injuries were sustained. The investigation narrowed its focus to Karter's mother, Kianna Davis, and her then-boyfriend, Kianna Davis. Medical experts documented not only the injury that ultimately caused Karter's death, but several additional injuries as well. According to testimony, the autopsy revealed a lacerated liver caused by blunt force trauma to the abdomen.
The cause of death in this case is blunt force injury to the abdomen, causing a lacerated liver.
Investigators also learned that Karter had suffered multiple external injuries and a hemorrhage beneath his scalp. Those findings became the foundation of the prosecution's case. Investigators now believed they were looking at a homicide.
This is a homicide. No doubt about it.
Despite the seriousness of the medical findings, arrests did not happen immediately. In October 2023, nearly 3 years after Karter's death, a Houston County grand jury indicted both Kianna Davis and Kianna Davis. The charges against Davis were extensive. She was accused of malice murder, felony murder, aggravated assault, and first-degree cruelty to children, among several additional counts. Benton was also indicted in connection with Karter's death. His case, however, will be handled separately at a later trial. For Karter's family, the indictments represented a major turning point. But an indictment is not a conviction. The burden now shifted to prosecutors, who would eventually have to convince 12 jurors beyond a reasonable doubt. That opportunity finally arrived in July 2026. Nearly 6 years after Karter died, Kianna Davis chose to testify. Taking the witness stand is one of the biggest decisions any defendant can make. Kianna Davis denied ever abusing or intentionally harming Karter. She maintained that neither she nor Kian Benton had caused the injuries that took her son's life.
I did not witness any type of anything. No.
But prosecutors returned to the same issue investigators had wrestled with from the beginning. If only 2 adults were caring for Karter during the period when doctors believed those injuries occurred, who else could have done it? Davis paused before answering. That is a good question we don't know.
So who would have done it if the only 2 people were he and you?
That is a good question.
So we just don't know.
We don't.
It was a brief exchange, but it captured the central conflict of the entire trial. The prosecution viewed that answer as evidence that no alternative explanation existed. The defense argued it demonstrated exactly why reasonable doubt remained. The jury would ultimately decide which interpretation they believed. After days of testimony, expert opinions, and closing arguments, the case was placed in the hands of 12 jurors. Deliberations began. At one point, proceedings were temporarily interrupted after reports of conflict involving a juror. The judge addressed the issue before deliberations resumed. At the time this documentary was produced, the jury was still deliberating, and no verdict had yet been announced. That means the most important question in this case remains unanswered for now. Will jurors conclude that prosecutors proved Kianna Davis was responsible for Karter Ambrose's death beyond a reasonable doubt? Or will they find that the evidence leaves room for reasonable doubt? Only the jury can answer that question. Whatever their decision, one fact cannot be disputed. A 2-year-old little boy lost his life. His family has lived with that loss since November 2020. As the legal process continues, the case remains a reminder of how complex child homicide investigations can become, especially when there are no eyewitnesses, no clear confession, and every conclusion depends on medical evidence, carefully reconstructed timelines, and the judgment of a jury. Now, the responsibility rests with the jury. Their verdict will not change what happened to Karter, but it will determine how the law responds to his death. If you've been following this case, I'd like to hear your thoughts after the verdict is announced. Which pieces of evidence stood out to you the most? And what questions do you think the trial answered or left unresolved? If you enjoy respectful, evidence-based true crime documentaries that follow verified facts rather than speculation, consider subscribing and turning on notifications. We cover complex criminal investigations from the first unanswered question through the final courtroom decision, always following the evidence wherever it leads.